examining a patient under psychiatric terms, that the mystery was solved. It was really a mystery story, but of course a fresh approach to it.
What about Strangers in the Train? The cutting back and forth between the lighter that's lost.
Ah, well, that was when he threatens. He threatens eventually, because the nice man won't carry out his part of the so-called bargain, because the bargain was never made. The hero was a tennis player, so that the villain, the weird guy, was on the way to the scene of the crime and was going to plant a piece of evidence which would make the hero definitely the murderer of his wife. But unfortunately, the hero was occupied with a tennis match. And I always remember when we shot the long shots at Forest Hills, and they were Davis Cup matches. And I said, would you mind having that thing removed, please? It's in the way, the Davis Cup. So they took it away for me, and then we did this whole tennis match. And of course, the moment the match was over, he dashed after the other man.
Through the years, you've achieved a great deal of fame and success. Do you like your fame? Does it give you a certain amount of pride?
Well, it enables me to sleep at night.
You're making a joke of the question, but...
No, I'm not making a joke. I mean, really hard question to answer, because...
I mean, does it ever make you feel happy or proud to arrive at an airport and have cameramen and reporters and people there to greet you?
Some little things like that are nice. I remember once arriving at Tel Aviv and coming down the steps and having the whole airport applaud. Well, that was very nice. And once I was standing in the middle of the square at Copenhagen, and it's a very large square, and the roadway, there's an intersection, and suddenly I heard the sound of an ambulance siren screaming. It came from the far corner of the square. I was just standing there, no camera or anything, with an assistant, and suddenly this ambulance stops at the intersection. A man jumped out, came rushing toward me, said, autograph, please. I gave him the autograph. He rushed back to the ambulance. They started the siren, and he went on his way.
Who was it?
That's what I don't know. I don't even know whether the autograph was for the patient or the driver.
Mr. Hitchcock, before we get down to serious business, I'd like first of all to very personally thank you for 40 years for me of marvelous movie-going. It's been a great pleasure seeing them and meeting you today. Most of the interviews I've seen and read with you have tended, I think, perhaps understandably, to concentrate on the bigger films, the later films, the Spellbound, the Rear Windows, and so on. And today, with your permission, I'd like to, initially at least, go back to the beginning and discuss some of the earlier films which may not be quite so familiar today, particularly since you worked in the German silent film. Yes. To ask you how much your early English films, particularly films like Number 17, really drew on the pictorial style that you may have picked up in the German cinemas and German studios.
Well, in those days, this would be about 1924, when the UFA studios were at their zenith almost. Mm-hmm. They emerged from a company called Dekla Bioskop. And in those days, I used to write the script and then become the art director. And I wasn't directing then, but I went to work at Neubabelsberg, and of course they were making some of the most famous films, the German films, the Nibelungen and Janning's The Last Laugh. Jannings was a tremendously important figure, as was Murnau, the director, Lang, Lubitsch, in those days. And I remember when I was working there, our picture was called The Blackguard, but they were making The Last Laugh. And in those days, it's just the opposite to what happens today. Everything was done on the lot. And it didn't matter what the set was, they'd build it. And I remember in The Last Laugh, Yannings. It was a story about the reverence that the Germans have for the uniform. And it's the only film ever made that told the story purely pictorially, without titles, without a word. Of course, it was silent films in those days anyway. And they even built a hotel with the lobby and all the streets outside, with all the traffic and everything. And they even built a railroad station with the great big glass roof and the locomotive and the passengers moving backwards and forwards. And they were, to me, prodigious jobs of production.
Yes. Of course, the late British silence and the early British talkers were pretty much dominated by borrowed German talent, cameramen, directors, and so on. And I think a film like your own, Number 17, is very, very German in its pictorial style. Do you remember that film?
Yes, but more than that, I think The Lodger, which was the third film. The first two films I made as a director were made in Munich, and I had to direct them in German. But of course, they were English stories played with German actors, character people, but it made no difference because there was no sound, just titles. When I got back to England to do Number 3 film, it was Mrs. Belloc Lowndes' famous book, The Lodger. And this is the story of a rooming house in London where she wondered and the rest of the family wondered whether the man upstairs is Jack the Ripper or not.
At one of your other early British films lately, the 1934 Man Who Knew Too Much, which I love because of the way it gets into the basic plot and the initial murder so very quickly and so very simply. You seem a little unhappy with the film. You refer to it as the work of a talented amateur, whereas your later film you consider that of a professional. I'm just wondering where you put the distinction, where you feel you stopped being an amateur and became that professional.
I think actually the difference would be that in the original Man Who Knew Too Much, I wasn't audience conscious, whereas in the second one I was.
But I must admit, many of us still feel that those early British films are by no means the work of an amateur, but I mean, represented in some way some of your best work.
The best thing, and I can't remember to this day, I think it was to involve the father more. You see, having had Stewart in the role, you had to change your story because in the original, Leslie Banks, the English actor, was in the lead, and he was caught and spent the end of the film locked up in a room. Well, you couldn't do that with a man of the stature of James Stewart. So your story had to be manipulated to give him more activity in the latter part.
Yes.
And in such a way, I lost the original story's climax, which was the famous Sydney Street Siege, which was a time about 1910 when 3 anarchists held up the whole of the British police force, the soldiers from the Tower of London, and just 3 of them. That's when Churchill went down. And there are photographs of him directing operations from a doorway. And these men held everyone up, and they were about to send to the nearest arsenal at Woolwich for the artillery to come out. It was, when I went to Scotland Yard researching for the second version, a rather officious public relations man answered me in an extremely peremptory way. I said, well, how would you handle the Sydney Street Siege today? Oh, he said, we just sent 2 men in with a dog.
Well, they wouldn't have anarchists today anyway in England.
Well, they have a different kind of anarchist.
One other point I wanted to get into was the technique you've developed and I'd say exploited through the years, sort of reaching past your actors and literally directing the audience so that you get the emotions you want, not by the players on screen, but by the by the people sitting in the audience, which of course is what any good director should do. But of course, you've made rather a specialty of it.
Well, the audience, that's what it's all about.
Yes, but when did you sort of become conscious of the fact that this was the way you would really specialize in directing?
I think during my American period, I became very conscious of audience. And
although there are hints in the beginning, because the close-up example of the glass of drugged wine in The Lady Vanishes is a very good example of directing the audience to that and not to the players.
That is true. Well, you see, that comes under the heading of avoiding the cliché. You see, the poisoned wine situation, or the drugged wine, the character usually picks it up and goes like that and says, oh, by the way, and you said this, and he does this about a half a dozen times, which is such a cliché. So I decided to avoid that cliché and merely leave the wine there untouched until the last minute. But in order to keep the audience reminded of it, I photographed the scene, part of the scene, through the two glasses. So that will keep the audience saying, well, when are they going to pick up the drugged wine?
I've heard you say in the past that, which is surprising for a director who makes so many thrillers and suspense films, that you don't basically like the device of the chase as part of your films. Is that because you are sort of limited to being on location, that you can't pre-plan that on the storyboard?
No, I think the chase is very good. But I've never gone in for the purely physical chase. I know it's very effective, and you've had it in many, many films. I think where I've changed is the chase to rescue someone. That I've never cross-cut. You see, in the early Griffith days, you know, he used to cross-cut with a man either going to the gallows or the guillotine with the rescuer on the way. Well, I've tended to avoid that kind of cross-cutting in a chase sequence and stayed either with one or the other, which makes the audience sweat the more, because you don't show the progress of the rescuer. Now, in The Birds, I did that once or twice. I had a girl seated in front of the schoolhouse smoking, and when she sits down, there's a child's play thing, I forget, jungle gym they call it. And there was one bird on it, you see. And I just put the camera on her and never showed what was going on behind until eventually she follows one bird through the sky. When she turns around, there's a mass of them. Now, you see, in the old technique, you would have cross-cut with the girl, say, little does she know it, but the birds are gathering outside. But when she saw them, she tiptoed into the school, took the teacher to the window and indicated them, never showed them. Then the teacher turned to the children and said, now you all go home, go down the street quietly. When I tell you to run, you run. From that moment, the children are herded toward the door of the schoolhouse, and I went straight to the birds and stayed with them and never moved them until suddenly you hear the patter of the feet and all the birds went up. And somebody said to me afterwards, what happened to that shot of the children when they went down the steps out of the school? I said, there was none. They said, oh, there must have been, there must have been. So it was making the audience carry the thing in their mind, you see.
In terms of the traditional sort of old-time Griffith cross-cutting, I think the chase you did in number 17 still holds up superbly. Perhaps because it's mainly miniature, and I guess you had the chance to pre-plan it.
Yes, you did. It was all made in miniature.
Those fantastic traveling shots of the car going under the bridge and the train moving forward at the same time, just incredible.
Yes, that was done by, you saw on the screen the rails and the roadway, and both train and Greyhound bus are coming toward you.
Green Line bus, please.
Green Line bus, yes. I was thinking of our American audience, you know. And they both come toward you, and suddenly you see the bus go across the front of the train, or what do you think? And the camera whips back, and the train goes under a bridge and the bus goes over the bridge.
What made you finally make the move to Hollywood? Because you always wanted to be the big Hollywood director, or because you'd done as much as you could in British film in that time?
Well, I was the #1 British